Back to today's video. Today is Monday, August 23rd, 2021, and today we're going to be jumping ahead a year and so to look at the Michigan gubernatorial race in 2022, in which Gretchen Whitmer now seems to be in an increasingly closer race against James Craig, the former police chief of the city of Detroit. You can see here that not many notable Republicans have actually announced besides James Craig. That is why you've really only seen polling data that has to do with him. Of those who have publicly expressed interest, you have John James, Ronna McDaniel, Stephen Crowder, and Mike Cox. Beyond there just simply aren't that many people who seem to be interested in running in 2022 in this Michigan race. Now, you can already start to see how the argument forms with James Craig being the former head of the Detroit Police Department, with the Republican Party ramping up their efforts to paint the Democratic Party as the party of crime, the party of defunding the police. That will be the rhetoric utilized in this Michigan race. And while in the initial polling data, Gretchen Whitmer was able to hold on to around a 6-point lead over James Craig, that lead has reduced to just 1 point 3 months later. So it shows that the race has gotten increasingly more competitive under a increasingly more competitive time for the Democratic Party nationwide, with Joe Biden's approval rating dropping and dipping down to a low point. And you can actually see here, I didn't have it pulled up initially, but it does show you that Joe Biden is approved of by just around 1 point nationally speaking. Now, it's a bit better than when he was actually disapproved of more than he was approved of, but it seems that he has bounced back to +1, but by no means is this a positive for Joe Biden. It seems that, during the immediate response to Afghanistan, that he ended up in the disapproval, and it pushed the Democratic Party down. And while this poll was taken not when Joe Biden was in the disapprove higher than the approve, it was still at a narrowing up point, and it was leading right into this time period that was negative for the Democratic Party. But we have to take a look at Michigan and about whether or not this race is going to be extremely competitive, and honestly, it just very well might be. You can actually take a look here if we go to the governor election. This is my most recent LTE projection. This was made on July 9th, 2021. I rated the state of Michigan as a lean Democratic state, and it made sense. You are looking at a race that was not really going to be the best state for Democrats, but maybe not the worst. Gretchen Whitmer is in that position where, due to her COVID-19 response and due to the way that she has handled a number of social issues, has been slammed by many members of the right wing. In fact, Donald Trump himself targeted Gretchen Whitmer heavily. Now, Gretchen Whitmer's name was a very recognizable one during the 2020 election season, not only because of her COVID-19 response and her praise from members of Democrats and others, but the fact that she had been floated as a potential name for Joe Biden's vice presidential ticket in 2020. There was some consideration about Gretchen Whitmer actually being the VP on the ticket, despite her being the recently elected governor of the state of Michigan. And we can actually take a look at that election. Now, I want you to understand that going into this election, the circumstances for the Democratic Party were much better than they are today. That's why Gretchen Whitmer was able to defeat Bill Schuette by around 10 points. In addition, she was popular because the Republican incumbent was unpopular. Rick Snyder, though he won re-election in 2014, fell out of favor due to a number of crises, including the Flint water scandal that was a very big part of the 2016 campaign. So looking at Gretchen Whitmer in 2018, while she had an extremely large margin, you do have to understand that it is very possible for the race to narrow up. What seems to be a 10-point margin and was a 10-point margin could very well be in the negative by the time the next election rolls around. And it reminds me of 2016, when Donald Trump flipped the state of Michigan for the first time since 1988, and what actually happened in the state of Michigan was monumental. I mean, Michigan had been a state that 8 years prior to this election, I want to show you the margin so you can understand just how much Donald Trump was able to swing the election. If you compare elections versus other elections, let's use 2016 and 2008. Keep your eye on Michigan. Michigan swung 16.7% to the right from 2008. 17 points more right wing in 8 years. If you compare it to 2012, a 4-year difference, Donald Trump shifted the state 10 points towards the right. So in 2016, you can see here that, Donald Trump was able to flip the state, and it shows just how quickly that the states such as Michigan can flip around. That's not the elections I wanted to take a look at here, but you can see that over time, Michigan actually has a pretty strong Democratic history. In 2020, though, you would actually see here that Joe Biden flipped the state back towards the Democrats, but only by 2.8%. It was by no means the 2018 margin of victory. So looking at these new numbers, it pretty much just tells us exactly what we could have expected once Joe Biden's approval rating began to deteriorate, that Democrats across the country would begin to struggle holding on to their constituencies because those same constituencies no longer support Joe Biden the way they did. Michigan today, if the election was held today for 2024, it could be anyone's. Looking at the election maybe 5 months ago, the Democrats would have been able to win Michigan again in 2024 had the election been held on that day. A lot of it is coming out to public opinion, and midterm elections are the first main opportunity for members of the opposition party to display their discomfort and their disapproval of the president of the United States, and they target races, including gubernatorial elections, and Michigan will certainly be on that target list. So let's see here if we can get the article. Apparently we cannot, the actual breakdown here of the numbers in the Michigan race, but it really doesn't matter beyond what we know from the fact that we are looking at a 1-point race for someone who won back in 2018 by 10 points. Now, Republicans actually have had an okay history in Michigan, despite Democrats having a long-lasting one on the presidential level. In 2010, they won the governorship, and they did in 2014. 2 years prior to the 2016 election, you might have been able to tell that the state might have been having a rightward shift because Rick Snyder won by 4.2%. It wasn't an overwhelming margin. It was nothing that was, I would say, out of the ordinary for a midterm election. I mean, you can take a look at what actually happened nationwide. States such as Maryland and Massachusetts elected Republicans. So for Michigan to have elected a Republican, it probably was a little bit more understanding. Ohio elected John Kasich by 30 points. Wisconsin, Scott Walker won by 5 points. Iowa, Terry Branstad won by over 20 points. Point being that across the nation, Republicans absolutely obliterated Democrats. In Nevada, Brian Sandoval won over 70% of the vote. That's absolutely unheard of to look at in terms of elections. I mean, that's comparable to Donald Trump in the state of Wyoming, but Nevada is a swing state that actually has a Democratic governor at this point. So looking at Michigan in 2014, Republicans have been able to win in the past, but it does not necessarily mean that they will be able to win in 2022. It really does come down to the circumstances of the race and who's actually going to be popular versus not. Now, Gretchen Whitmer seems to have fallen in and out of public opinion over the past couple of years. In 2019, she was slammed by Donald Trump, obviously not for COVID-19, but just for a number of other issues. In 2020, due to her COVID-19 response, she actually was pretty restrictive. She imposed a mask mandate. She understood that the race was competitive in Michigan and that it was a swing state, but she still did not sacrifice public safety for votes. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, there are some states where there are Democratic governors who are much more lenient on COVID-19. For example, in Louisiana, versus some other Democratic governors in Republican states. For example, Andy Beshear in the state of Kentucky. He, made the schools virtual. He pretty much did everything else that other Democratic governors did, but it will come back to bite you later on. It will come back to you, and that's just the way that American politics works. Now, in Michigan, though, I would say that Gretchen Whitmer did not sacrifice public safety. She was able to impose the mask restrictions and everything that she needed to do while still keeping that core electorate pleased, in a sense, to vote for Joe Biden on the presidential level. And of course, Joe Biden would not be directly blamed for the actions taken by Whitmer or other types of governors, but I do think that was something that she kept in mind for 2020, and it absolutely helped Joe Biden. Gretchen Whitmer's influence on Joe Biden in 2020 definitely upticked his victory. Would he have lost if Gretchen Whitmer was not in that state? Probably not, but he probably would not have won by the same margin that he did in this state. So you can see here that now, looking at the circumstances of where we stand today, that the race just got closer. Now, there was one poll that I also did want to point out that Competitive Edge Research and Communication showed that James Craig actually had a 7-point lead over Gretchen Whitmer. Now, this is a Republican internal. I don't entirely buy that. I also don't buy that James Craig would take this much and that there's a 12-point difference between those who support Gretchen Whitmer against John James and those who support him against James Craig. If anything, I really think that this poll shows is meant to prop up James Craig's numbers, which is why even Real Clear Politics refuses to put it in the overall average. It's only Target Insight and Epic MRA. So looking at the polls here, you can see that while it was a 6-point lead in May of 2021, it has reduced to a 1-point lead. And there are some other polls here for some potential candidates. John James has not confirmed or denied that he's going to be running in 2022 in the governor election. Candace Miller, same exact thing. But against a generic Republican, this Republican internal as well shows that the generic Republican defeats Gretchen Whitmer by 11 points. I don't buy that either. You don't go from winning by 10 to losing by 11. That's not how it works. Donald Trump didn't even have that much of a shift, and Donald Trump was certainly a candidate that we had not seen the likes of before. And when there is another Donald Trump type rerun, Democrats will know exactly how to handle it and exactly where they're going to be targeting and how they're going to be campaigning. And that's what we might see here in James Craig. If you take a look at him, he probably is going to run on that anti-abolish the police platform, especially in Detroit specifically. I think that is a main area where you will see James Craig able to capitalize on a lot of the crime reporting and a lot of his experience as the head of the Detroit Police Department. And you can see here that he actually used to be a Democrat. That's also something that might be interesting to point out when he runs for governor, because if he is one of those ex-Democrats, it would be something that might be able to inspire more voters to turn out to vote. I can't tell you how many people voted for Obama in 2008 and then voted for Trump in 2016. It was an overwhelming large amount. Many people did so. In fact, voted for Obama in 2012. And there are certainly Obama, Trump, Biden voters that might be inclined to vote for a Republican again in 2022. Or there might be McCain, Romney, Clinton, Biden voters that will be voting in 2022 that will now be in a position where they will again be inclined to vote for a Republican on the ballot. And that's what we're starting to see, because Whitmer is now underperforming not only her 2018 margin, which makes sense given the circumstances of the year, was a much better year for the Democratic Party. She will certainly underperform this margin, but she also looks like she's on track to underperform Joe Biden, despite Joe Biden flipping this state from red to blue, whereas Gretchen Whitmer only needs to retain the state. I understand she has room to fall, but that is a lot of falling when you drop 9 points relative to your previous election margin. Being up 1 point is not at all good for the Democratic Party. It may indicate that she has obviously a chance at victory, which I never doubted for a second, but I don't necessarily think that it is a good chance of victory at this point if you are looking at her just being ahead by 1 point. Now, that would be only if I was trusting in the poll 100%. Obviously, there are other things that go into account when it comes down to these individual governor races, when it comes down to these very, very competitive races. But all in all, what I see here is that Gretchen Whitmer has decreased in terms of her overall support. Joe Biden has as well. 2018 is not going to be similar. 2022 is not going to be similar to 2018, and it might not even be super close to 2020. So all around, these circumstances don't exactly tell me that Whitmer is in an extremely powerful position ahead of 2022. While it probably won't be 2014, and it definitely won't be 2018, it could be a mix of 2020 or 2016. A Gretchen Whitmer victory of 1 to 2 points wouldn't necessarily be out of the ordinary given where we stand today, where Joe Biden stands, where the American public stands on COVID-19. Because Gretchen Whitmer, as a Democratic governor, needs to govern as a swing state type governor. But historically speaking, based off the way she has governed for the past 3 years, she has taken cautions about that, understanding that her state is a swing state, but hasn't treated it to the same way that Ron DeSantis has treated the state of Florida, or hasn't treated Michigan the same way some other Democratic governors have opened up some other states that might be more Republican. So it is just interesting to see. I think that looking at these new numbers, it tells you that this race is going to be one of the most competitive. And the Republican Party hasn't shied away from indicating that this race is going to be competitive, and Democrats seem to be very clearly invested in Gretchen Whitmer's re-election bid. She is the only Democrat that has even considered running, even talked about a possible candidacy, and the only one who has declared so far. And I think that shows that there's unity within the party. Sometimes when you have governors, and we are going to see this with a number of Republican governors in 2022, where they will be tried to be primaried by more ideologically left or right wing politicians. Now, for the Democrats, we have seen a number of primary challengers. I really think that the Democratic Party is being smart about this, saying that they do not need a primary challenger, that Gretchen Whitmer is going to be in a competitive position and doesn't need anything else tagging on to her. For the Republican side, while there are a number of people announced, James Craig seems to be the only notable one, and it seems very clear based off of what the polls are telling us that he is going to be that Republican nominee. Now, the race might be shaken up if some people enter into the race. Other representatives, other attorneys, the former Speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives, there might be some people that wish to speak that wish to enter into this race and could make it more competitive in terms of the Republican primary. But for right now, we know that James Craig, the former head of the Detroit Police Department, is going to be potentially that Republican nominee, has been treated as such by the polling data so far. One name you might recognize is Betsy DeVos. She's actually the former chair of the Michigan Republican Party and the former U.S. Secretary of Education. Now, the interesting thing about Betsy DeVos is that her name is very recognizable across the state of Michigan. She owns a lot of property across the state, and her name gets up across that eastern side of Michigan, all across actually Michigan, I would say. So she could have had heavy influence, but obviously she would not have been a good chance, a good type of Republican to run in this race. So all in all, Michigan is going to be one of the most closest one of the closest races of the election cycle. I already have it rated as an extremely close race. I don't have it as my closest one so far. I would say that probably goes to Georgia or Pennsylvania, one of those states, or Wisconsin. But Michigan will be right up there. Michigan certainly will be close, and it is not at all safe for the Democratic Party to even treat this race as they are leaning. Right now, I do think that they have an advantage, but that does not mean they can sort of be in a position of any type of complacency. They need to treat this race very seriously. Otherwise, they are going to lose the state of Michigan at this rate. A 9-point decline over 2 years, 3 years is not a good sign for 2022. Gretchen Whitmer needs to make up those numbers, and so does Joe Biden, because a lot of them are closely tied together. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.